Hello and welcome to my build of the Revell 1/76 scale M24 Chaffee tank. I'm sorry, but this is a bit of a disjointed build because I started this back in March 2022. Unfortunately, I have a cancer. I have an incurable cancer. I have follicular lymphoma, which is a blood cancer, which is incurable. Well, shortly after I started this build, my health went downhill and I had to go back on treatment, so I couldn't get back to finishing this build. So there's been several gaps in the build and it's taken me several months. It's now October 2022 and I've finally finished it. But it's meant that the video's been a bit disjointed because I've used different cameras and I can't set the scenes up the same way because of the many months gaps. But other than that, let's get on with it. First thing I do when I get any kit that I'm going to start is I get out the instructions and I read them thoroughly. I know a lot of people just like to dive in, but I actually read the instructions properly. And at this point, I also choose which paint scheme. Next thing I do is I check to see if all of the parts are on the sprue. Make sure everything's there. If it is, then I'm happy. I also look for malformed or mismolded parts that were malformed during the injection molding process. If there's none of those, there's no parts missing, then I'm ready to begin. I look at the kit and I look at how I'm going to paint it. And like I said, I've chosen the plain olive drab scheme, which means I can actually paint most of the model in the spray booth. But there are some things that I need to paint before I put them on the model, and they're best painted on the sprue. In this case, it's the wheels and the tyres because they're a completely different colour. Once they're on the tank, they'll be very difficult to paint, so I begin by painting them on the sprue. This is what I do with all models. I look at the parts that are difficult to paint once they're assembled, and I paint them while they're still on the sprue. That just leaves me just a couple of bits on the end where I've cut them off the sprue to paint, which makes life a lot easier. Now I start following the instructions, the steps in the instructions. Start by separating the bits from the sprue. Now, I found with Revell kits that they're not that easy to get a clean separation from the sprue, and there's always a bit of flash left, or some little bits from the nippers where the nippers can't quite get in, so I end up having to sand them down. I use sanding sticks for that, which makes it very easy to get into those intricate areas. Once I've removed the parts for an assembly stage from the sprue, the next thing I like to do is sand them. Once I've sanded them and got rid of all the little flash and the little nipples that are left, is I like to marry them up to each other to make sure they all fit, and I practice assembling them 2 or 3 times. The reason I do this is very simple, because over the years I've been very arrogant sometimes and I've just assumed that I've got everything right and I've glued it together, only to find out that I've got a part back to front or a part upside down or a part backwards, and then I have to separate them and start again. And when you separate the pieces, it's never as easy to glue them back together. So I do this 2 or 3 times to make sure they all fit before I cement them. Getting older, my eyesight isn't what it was. I find some of these very small parts very hard to see, so I constantly have to check, double check, and then treble check with the sprue plan which part I'm cutting. I've lost count a number of times, but I've cut off the wrong part and then tried to attach it and realised it's the wrong part. So I like to get it right at this stage by checking, double checking, and treble checking. The glue I'm using here isn't actually glue, it's a solvent called MEK, methyl ethyl ketone, and it's got the same consistency of water, and it's a very precise solvent. You can use a pin or a needle to actually drop very, very precise solvent where you need it, or you can paint it on like I do. What it does is it melts the top layer of the polystyrene. So you just brush it on one side, brush it on another, and then get the two sides together before it evaporates, and it forms a good solid bond. This is where using MEK as a glue comes in very handy. On this part of the model, this is the turret, and it's actually meant to move up and down on the completed model. But you've got to be very precise with the glue, because if you spill it in the wrong place, it'll actually glue the turret so the turret won't move. So I find that polystyrene cements, even ones like Tamiya, are thin, are malleable or fluid enough, thin enough to actually allow me that exact precise way of gluing exactly the point that I need. Hence I use MEK for these parts. Turret of this model, when I assembled them, the test assembly, I noticed it was slightly out of true and it would leave a little gap at the bottom. And I decided to try some Vallejo putty. I've never used it before. And so what I did is I got the tube and I snipped the top off, as you do, and I started to squeeze and the putty wouldn't come out. I thought, bloody hell, this is a brand new tube of putty. Why isn't a putty coming out? So I squeezed harder. And then I really squeezed, and then the putty came out from the bottom. The whole tube exploded out of the bottom. Dickhead here, because I'm so used to the one that I had, didn't realise that with the Vallejo one, you have to unscrew the applicator, and then inside there's another little cap that you've either got to cut off or peel off, I forget which, and I hadn't done that. So, of course, when I put the maximum pressure on the tube, it squirted everywhere. So that was a complete waste of a tube of putty. So I had to go and buy another one and just learn my lesson from there. But from now on, I always check to make sure there's not a secondary cap. Now we come to the part of model making that I enjoy the most, spraying the model. I've made two parts so far. I've made the main body and I've made the main turret. But I'm not putting them together yet because I want to spray them. Because once they're together, it'll be very awkward to get colour into some of the places under the turret. So it's easier just to spray them as two separate things. The first coat that I make on any model is always a primer coat. In this case, I'm using grey surface primer. This smooths and finishes the surface, ready to accept the top coat, to give the top coat a much nicer finish. For airbrushing, I thin the paint down until it's roughly the consistency of milk, which is normally a 2-to-1 ratio of paint to water. I only use acrylic paints and I thin them with water only. I'm a member of quite a few modelling groups on Facebook and Reddit, and one thing that's always guaranteed to start a fight amongst everybody is, what do you thin airbrush paints with? Some will say water, some will say airbrush thinners, some will say other things, and everybody swears by whatever they think is the best. You know, it's mostly airbrush thinners are the essential. Never ever thin them with water, but I've always thinned acrylics with water. It's never given me a problem. It's so much easier to clean up as well. That's why I like acrylics. I clean my acrylics with water, I thin them with water, and I'm quite happy using water. I've never spent money on specialised thinners. Okay, that's the surface primer coat applied to everything that I'm going to do in the spray booth. Now I leave it to dry, which normally takes about an hour. Sometimes it's touch dry after about 15 minutes. I like to give it about an hour to fully cure. Once that's dry, I then put the top coat on. In this case, it's going to be an olive drab variation. Again, I thin it down with water. I will add that I do use demineralised water. I don't use tap water, I use demineralised water. But I thin it down with water, again to the consistency of milk, which is more or less a 2-to-1 ratio, 2 paint to 1 water. But as long as it's the consistency of milk, different makes of paint, the consistency varies when you start. But I always like to get it so it drips off the stick like milk, and that's the ideal consistency for spraying. So now I put the top coat on, as well as spraying parts of the sprue with the top coat before I cut them off. Again, the reasons being pure laziness, that once they're off the sprue and they're actually on the model, it's very difficult to paint them. If I paint them on the sprue, it makes my life a lot easier, because then all I have to do is just paint the bits where I've cut them off with the sprue and not the whole thing. I have to do some touching up after the models come out of the spray booth, mainly where I've actually used the clips to hold the model. I try and always clip it in a place that's not going to be visible, but sometimes that's not always possible. And also sometimes I don't actually get the spray even, and it might need a little bit of a retouch here and there. So I manually touch it up. Again, I thin the paint to about a 2-to-1 ratio before I apply it. Because this is a 1/76 scale model, some of the parts are really small and fiddly, and I'm getting on a bit. I've got arthritis in my fingers and hands, which isn't really helping me, and I really don't like doing these small and fiddly bits, but needs must. Here I'm putting the tyres and the wheels together. When you're using glue on the small parts like the wheels and tyres like I am, it's very difficult to stop getting your hands dirty and getting paint and glue on your fingers. So sometimes I use gloves, but I don't like using gloves. I find that I make my hands very sweaty and they're not as sensitive for picking up the smaller parts. So I end up getting the right hump with them and taking them off like I have here. I've switched from using MEK to using Tamiya polystyrene cement for these smaller parts. The reason being is they haven't got very much of a surface area that you're gluing, so I like to put a fairly sticky glue on them to help make sure that the parts go together and stay together. With MEK, you're only coating small surfaces, and sometimes you just can't get the part to stay stuck on, so I use the stickier glue for these parts. With this particular model, I find a lot of the smaller parts, when they come away from the sprue, they're not coming away from the sprue cleanly. Even though I'm using nippers and I'm cutting right to the edge of the part, it still leaves a little bump on it that has to be sanded down before painting. I use sanding sticks for this. I think sanding sticks are great. I do have some files that I use, but I prefer to use sanding sticks for intricate sanding work. This is what I mean about using the sanding sticks for getting off the small burrs that appear on these wheels. And I really can't, no matter how close I cut with the nippers, I really can't remove all the burr. I've got to use a sanding stick to remove it, and then just glue them together and then just paint over where I've done the sanding. As I'm getting older, I'm getting arthritis in my thumbs and fingers, which makes this a very difficult job, and I really hate these small fiddly bits, but that's something you have to deal with when you're dealing with a 1/72 kit. Finally, that's over. Making wheels for tank, I actually find to be a bit of a ball ache because there's 8 or 10 little wheels either side that I've got to make, so it's doing the same thing over and over again. And it really does reach the end of my boredom threshold, but I've done them. Now what I'm going to do is I'm going to put them away safely in a container so I don't drop them on the floor and lose them, because I've done that in the past. I lost one single wheel from a tank that's caused all sorts of problems, and I've ended up throwing the model away, but I learnt to keep them safe. I'm just touching up the turret and body that I painted in the spray booth a bit earlier because I looked at them and I thought that needs a little bit of touching up there, because I obviously didn't spray it properly, but I've just touched them up then. And now I'm starting to add the wheels to the side of the tank. And like I say, this is another repetitive job I really don't like doing because it's the same thing over and over again. But that's what you have to do with tanks. That's why I mainly build cars, motorbikes and planes, because of the wheel issue. It really is. I really don't like doing tanks. But I thought I'd start with this kit. So on with it we go. Now I'm touching up the parts of the wheels that I filed the burr off earlier, because I wasn't going to paint them until I'd actually got them on the model. Otherwise I'd probably end up knocking the flakes of paint off and having to repaint them again. So it's easier if I get them on the model first and then just add that little bit of touch-up paint. These wheels, the front wheels, are the same colour as the body, so that makes it nice and easy. Because I sprayed the body all over in the spray booth, it covered all the parts that I need to actually use to glue the wheels to the body. So what I have to do is I have to sand and file off the paint on those parts, otherwise they won't stick. And I've got to do the same with the wheels on the inside. Because I painted them all over, I've then got to go back and I've got to take off the paint from the parts that used to stick to the parts on the tank. Now I can start to assemble the turret and the body. Now I'm making up and adding the tracks to the bottom of the tank. Now I'm going to paint the parts of the wheels where I had to file the burr off. If you remember, I said I wasn't going to paint those until they were on the model. Otherwise, I would end up having to repaint them again and again. So now they're stuck on the model, I'm actually going to paint them. One thing I can't stress enough is the easiest way to avoid making any mistakes when you're building a kit is to keep checking the instructions. Even if you know what you're doing, double check the instructions. This is a habit that I've got myself into, because when I don't, I end up making mistakes and not realising until I'm a lot further into the build. Now that I've got the wheels painted, I'm going to start to assemble the body of the tank. Now I'm assembling what I would call the mudguards. I don't know what they're really called. I just call them the mudguards. The bit that go over the tracks on the side of the body. And it's at the stage now where I'm just going to put on all the little bits that need to go onto the tank, like lights, the gun and things like that. What I'm now doing is I'm now putting together the base of the diorama, which is just 2 bits that need to be welded together. Once they're dry, what I will do is I will use a polystyrene filler to fill the gap between the two so that it looks like one piece rather than 2 stuck together. Now we come to adding the water slide transfers for the decals. Now, I used to use water many years ago, and then I discovered something called decal fix and decal coat to soften the transfers and make them matte and easier to manipulate and mould to certain parts of the body. But they're a bit of a money pit and they're quite expensive. I discovered a way of making my own solution with stuff that I already had here that works out at about 3 to 4% of the cost. So whereas I was paying something like £8 for 50 mils of decal coat or decal fix, I can actually make 500 mils for the same amount of money, and it really works. But I'll give you more details about that in another video, because that's my secret recipe, and I don't want to give it away straight away. So if you want to know what my secret recipe is for decal fix and decal coat, you'll have to watch one of my other videos when I get round to making it. Now I'm putting plastic putty in the gap where I join the 2 halves of the diorama together. Once that's dried, I'm going to paint the diorama. Or once that's dried, I'm actually going to have to sand that down slightly, then paint the diorama, is what I should have said. While I'm waiting for the putty to dry, what I'm doing is I'm actually going round and I'm actually accenting some of the panels with a fine line artist pen. Some people use a wash or things like Tamiya panel line colour, but I prefer to actually use an artist pen to do it. I'm just making a few minor touch-ups to the tank where some of the adhesive, some of the glue has actually drifted onto the paint, and I'm just touching that up where I've added the small bits. Now that the putty's dry, I'm going to paint the base of the diorama. I always thin my paints, whether I'm spraying or painting with a brush. I always use acrylic paints, don't use enamel paints anymore. I always thin them. I always thin them at a ratio of about 2 to 1 for brush painting, which is 2 parts paint, 1 part water. I find that it's easier. The paints are too thick and you can't really get into small spaces when they're not thin, so I like to thin them when I'm brush painting it. Even if it means I have to give something 2 coats, I think you get better performance by thinning them. And here we are, all finished. Now, I don't claim to be any sort of great scale modeller by any stretch of the imagination. I don't really weather them like some of these experts do because I've got no experience in them. But I do enjoy building them, and that's what it's all about. And I get a great sense of satisfaction once I've built them. I will eventually try and weather them, but not for a while. I just want to enjoy the fact that I've built them. Anyway, I hope you enjoyed watching this video as much as I enjoyed making it. I'm laughing because this video has actually taken me about 7 months all told to make with the problems with my health, but I hope you enjoyed it as much as I did. See you for the next one.